In the Gospel of John, the invitation is simple. Come and see. Come see Jesus, the one who meets us in our questions, who brings light into our dark places, who offers living water when we're thirsty for more. This isn't about religion. It's about knowing him deeply. The door is open. Come on in and find life in him.
Where the red fern grows, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Hobbit, and The Outsiders. Those were my favorite books in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, each respectively. Those are my favorite books. Now, great books, incredible books, opened up my imagination as a young man. And as I got older, there were other books that became favorite books. We have different books that are favorite books. Years ago, G.K. Chesterton, who is a British writer, was invited to join in a meeting, a gathering of leading intellectuals in England. I mean, across many different disciplines and fields, they brought the sharpest and brightest minds together, and Chesterton was invited in the field of literature. And as they had all of these brightest people, the most brilliant minds of all of England, they posed a question to this group. If you were shipwrecked and left on an island but could only have one book, what would be the book that you would choose? And they figured that, with some of these most intelligent and the leaders of their fields, that they would compile this list, and if there were some repeats, you would begin to get kind of these are the books that you ought to really read. And Chesterton, who was a prominent Christian, everyone just assumed that his answer would be the Bible, of course, because he was very vocal about his faith. So when it came around to his turn, G.K. said, well, if I were to be shipwrecked on an island and I could only have one book, and they're all thinking, yeah, the Bible, come on, get with it. He said, if I could only have one book, I think I would choose Thomas's Guide to Practical Shipbuilding. Because that book would pave the way to a preferred future, a life that he wouldn't have to be stuck and lost for the rest of his life, that would open up new opportunities. And I was thinking about if someone came to me and said, Pastor, we've got someone, they don't have any church background, they don't know anything about the Bible, they don't know anything about religion, but you can only give them one book out of the Bible. I thought, well, would it be Psalms because there's all the reality of life, but the comfort that comes with our great shepherd? Or would it be Proverbs because there's everyday practical advice in Proverbs, so much practical wisdom? Or maybe Romans because there's deep, deep theology there. Or maybe Leviticus, because it is the cure for insomnia. But I thought, no, if there was one book that I would choose, it would be the book of John, the Gospel of John. And today we're launching in on a study, on an excursion into the book of John. And I am so glad that you're here. Those of you online, so glad that you're joining us as we do this. I mentioned those 4 books from my 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th grade years. In those years, I lived in Clark County, Washington, Southwest Washington. And we lived there, my mom still lives there, but I was there for about 15 years. And during those 15 years, we lived in 2 different houses. Both of them were just a couple of miles away from Clark College, a local community college, a JUCO there. And one of my favorite childhood and teenage memories was going to a place called, just north of town, called Louisville Park. And through that ran the East Fork of the Lewis River. In fact, I went to Lewis Junior High School. So these names, Clark and Lewis, better known as Lewis and Clark, were everywhere. Now, if you know history, Lewis and Clark set out on an expedition. Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, on May 14th, 1804, left St. Louis, Missouri, or Missouri, I've been told, depending on where you're from. They left to go explore the Louisiana Territory. And so they went for 2 years, 4 months, and 9 days. They went on this excursion to learn, to explore, to grow, to find out, to discover. But they didn't go by themselves. And it wasn't just with Sacagawea. In fact, their expedition was also known as the Corps of Discovery, not C-O-R-E Corps, C-O-R-P-S Corps. That this company of discovery that would go on this journey, that would go on this excursion, that they would learn and they would discover new things. The reason I tell you that is that today, as we launch into the book of John, we are the core of discovery. And while I promise you, this series will not go for 2 years, 4 months, and 9 days, this will be the longest series we have ever done in the history of this church. We are going to dig into the book of John, and we will not be done until the end of May. Last night I said April or May. This morning I just made a decision. Because there will always be more. So we are going to be in this the entire school year, and I am so excited that you're a part of this launch of this series. We're going to look at the Gospel of John, and very often at the beginning of a series, I'll give you some backstory and kind of the backdrop, kind of lay down the foundation for that. So I'll do that for a moment here today. The Gospel of John is one of 4 Gospels. Some of you are familiar with this: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each of these writers give their account of Jesus' life and their experience or what they've heard about Jesus' life. And in each of these, there are some stories that are told. Now, John is different than the other 3. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have some stories that they repeat. John is different, and we'll look at some of those differences today, and in subsequent weeks we will as well. But John was the last gospel to be written. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were earlier ones. John was written probably 60 to 70 years after Jesus' crucifixion, his death, and his resurrection, and his ascension. Probably about 60 or 70 years. It was written by, of all people, John, thus the name. And John was one of Jesus' 12 disciples. Now, it's generally agreed that John was probably the youngest of the 12 disciples. He may have been as young as 15 when he began to follow Jesus. And he had a brother named James, and they were fishermen. That was the family business. Their dad, Zebedee, had this fishing business, and they were fishing on the Sea of Galilee. And one day, Jesus came along to them and just said these words, "Come follow me." And then he made this really weird statement that they didn't understand. He said, "Come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Okay. So they did. And for 3 years, they walked with Jesus. They had a front row seat. They got to see, hear, experience all that Jesus was doing, all that he was teaching, all of the things of his life. And they got to experience this. Now, they were the brothers, James and John, sons of Zebedee, but Jesus gave them a nickname, Sons of Thunder. Maybe in your small group, you could discuss what would you have to do to have Jesus give you and your brother the nickname Sons of Thunder. Regardless, apparently they were a bit passionate, maybe impetuous, maybe didn't think things all the way through. In fact, there was a time when Jesus and his disciples were going through Samaria, and there was a village of Samaritans that didn't want Jesus there and didn't want the disciples there. And James and John, the Sons of Thunder, came to Jesus with a fabulous idea. They said, "Jesus, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy the village?" Which goes a bit contrary to Jesus' teaching about loving your enemies. However, they were ready to take things into their own hands. And there was another time when they got their mom involved to try and get them to have prominent places. But here's his Sons of Thunder, and John is one of them. And after his 3 years with Jesus, there's a transformation in his life, because John is known in church history and in religious circles as the apostle of love, because more than any other New Testament writer, he spoke more of the importance of love than any of the rest. In fact, again, church history and tradition would say, in his dying breaths, his final words were these: "Little children, love one another." Now, James and John, along with their buddy Peter, are a part of the 12 disciples, but they're a special group. They're like an inner circle group. There were 12, no doubt, but these 3, Peter, James, and John, Jesus had a closer connection with them, that they got to experience some things that the other 9 apostles didn't get to see. So like there was a time in one of the pinnacles of Jesus' entire life where the disciples, 9 of them are left, but he takes Peter, James, and John up to the Mount of Transfiguration. And it's an amazing thing, because all of a sudden Moses shows up and Elijah shows up, and Jesus becomes dazzling white, brighter than anything they'd ever seen before in this moment that happens. And John is right there experiencing that. These 3 got to experience the deepest pain and the darkest night with Jesus on the Garden of Gethsemane, when they were going across the Kidron Valley, and Judas was off preparing to betray him, and the 11 disciples come, and 8 of them stay, but Jesus takes Peter, James, and John a little deeper into the garden, and they saw his anguish. They saw his pain. Just hours before, in the upper room, it was John who was sitting right next to Jesus, close enough that he could lean up against him. And then the next day, John was the only disciple at the foot of the cross. All the others had deserted him. John alone saw Jesus crucified and dying and died. And while Jesus was on the cross, he looks down at John. He sees his grieving mother. In essence, he says to John, take care of my mom for me. Let her be your mom. And John did. And church history would say that John eventually took Mary, the mother of Jesus, to Ephesus when it became too volatile in Jerusalem, that he took her to Ephesus. And that's where she spent her dying years. And can you imagine the conversations that John and Mary had throughout life? Thinking back, not only hearing all the stories of his childhood, but thinking back on those 3 years of ministry. And in retrospect, looking at, he did that, but you know what we didn't understand at the time was this. And how that related to this. And as they think back and as they discuss it, he begins to just get all of this insight and meaning to things deeper than maybe they had ever even realized before. And now you fast forward years later, and he's in his late 80s, maybe his early 90s. He's there in Ephesus. He's spent some time exiled to an island in Patmos. He's seen incredible things. And can you imagine when he comes into church, the people whisper, there he is. He was one of the 12. He was with Jesus. He got to experience it. All the things we've heard about, he was there. And the questions that they would pose, John, tell us about it. Tell us what it was like when you guys were out on that boat and you were all scared to death and Jesus spoke the word. Tell us what that was like. Tell us what it was like when Peter tried to walk on. Tell us that story again, that he tried to walk on the water. And tell us about Zacchaeus. Come on, tell us about that little guy. Tell us about Zacchaeus and tell us all these things. And now as he's in his late 80s, early 90s, John takes his quill and he decides that he will record his account of Jesus and his life. Now, as I said before, this is the last gospel to be written, and it's different than the other three. The other three have stories, and some of them repeat the stories of each other, stories that John completely leaves out, and rightfully so. Why would they've already been written? This would be redundant. And John writes some things. He writes details that the other three don't write. He writes about events that the other three don't mention. He writes some insights and some meaning that come only after decades of looking back on all that Jesus did. John writes stuff that the other three don't. And he writes these stories that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't record, we'd never heard of in their gospels. And well, why not? There are so many stories to choose from. How do you even pick? In fact, at the end of his gospel, he writes these words in John 21, verse 25. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So much. And so as he prepares to write, he's thinking about every week when people see him at church, when people come to his house to visit, they always ask, tell us what this was like, tell us what this was like, tell us what this was like. And he comes to this point where he almost says, you're asking the wrong question. I could tell you the history of Jesus, and I will. Matthew, Mark, and Luke gave you the history of Jesus. I want you to understand the mystery of Jesus. Not just what he did, but who he is. Because you can have all the historical data, you can know all of those things, but if you don't know him, then you've missed out on all of it. And so he embarks on this journey because knowing who he is the most important fact of human history. So we'll start at the beginning, but not yet. Before we get into it, we have to go to the end of his book and the end of his writing, because at the end, he gives kind of this summary statement that tells us why he even wrote this account in the first place, what his plan was, what his hope was, what his prayer was, the reason, the why behind the book of John. And this is what we find in John chapter 20, verse 31. He writes this. He's just got through all this book. But these things are written that you may believe, here's the why, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. He says, I don't want you to just know a bunch of knowledge about Jesus so you can win at the Jesus quizzing contest. I don't want you to just know all the things that he did. I don't want you to just know the history. I want you to believe that he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And when you believe that, you will experience life in his name. And what I love about that is that he says right up front, listen, don't just get filled up with a bunch of information. And it summarizes why we even exist here at Cornwall Church. That our goal is to help people find and follow Jesus. And that's why he says, this is my goal for my gospel. Find and follow Jesus. That's what we're about. And let me just be really clear. Full disclosure here. That's what we want for every single one of you. I don't want there to be a mystery. I don't want you to feel like a bait and switch. We want you to find and follow Jesus. That's why I'm so excited about us embarking on this journey through the book of John, to see what he says about Jesus as we find and follow him. Not just so that we can have more knowledge. This is so much more deeper, so much more significant, so much more, shall I use the word, crucial. It's not just the knowledge of him, but life in him. If that's true, if what John writes about is true, then this is by far the most important thing in all of life. Amen. Now, there may be some of you who are sitting here saying, well, I believe in the historical Jesus. Most people would, just historically, he was a person in history. I believe it. But this whole thing, Son of God, Messiah, God, I'm not sure. I got some doubts. I don't buy it. You know what? Fantastic. Neither did his disciples most of the time. We're glad you're here. And I hope that you'll stay in here, and I hope that you'll hear what John has to say about Jesus. I was talking to a friend of mine several months ago, and we're talking about our children and raising kids, and he made this statement. He said, if my children choose to reject Jesus and walk away from the faith, who I believe and what we've built our home on, if they choose to reject Jesus and walk away from the faith, I want them to be very, very clear who they're rejecting and what they're walking away from. And I think this is so important because sometimes people say they're walking away from Jesus and what they're really walking away from is the American church. So John writes this book and he says, I want you to be very, very clear about who Jesus is. So that if you choose to reject him, that's fine, but I want you to know who it is that you're walking away from. So today, in our time, we're going to look at 5 verses, the first 5 verses. And I just got to tell you, if I was Lewis or Clark, we would take this series for 2 years because these first 5 verses could easily be a series in and of themselves. There's so much we could spend 5 weeks on this. We're just going to have to just kind of scratch the surface on this. But John makes it so clear. He says, I want you to know who we're talking about when we're talking about Jesus. And what we will find in these first 5 verses is some of the deepest theology on Jesus you will ever see and some of the greatest glory and the transcendent greatness of Jesus that you will ever see. And I think that John is saying right from the beginning, you cannot exaggerate the greatness and the glory of Jesus. So these are the 5 verses that we're going to look at today. John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it, has not comprehended it, has not overcome it. Oh, what a beautiful piece of scripture. Now, when Matthew, Mark, and Luke start their account of Jesus, they all start in different places. Like Mark, what's wrong with Mark? He doesn't even like Christmas. He doesn't even give the birth narrative stuff. Mark, the war against Christmas started with Mark. This is it. Mark starts when Jesus and John, his relative, are adults. That's where he starts. So he's like, let's start when they're 30 years old. Okay, fine, we'll start there. Luke, he's our Christmas guy. I mean, we come to Luke every December, don't we? And Luke loves Christmas. Luke gives all the birth narrative. In fact, he goes a little before that. He goes back to Zechariah and Elizabeth and John the Baptist, who was Jesus' relative, is 6 months older than Jesus. He goes back there and says, yeah, let's get Christmas, but let's get into November. All right, and then Matthew comes along. He says, man, you guys haven't gone far enough. And he goes back through the Old Testament, gives this whole lineage of all these individuals from the Old Testament, all these begats, and all this stuff from the Old Testament. John comes along and says, none of you have gone back far enough. You haven't even come close. Let's go back to before the beginning. John 1:1, he says this. In the beginning, and some of you are saying, wait, I've heard that before. I've heard that from another book in the Bible. Well, we'll come back to that. In the beginning was the Word. And you see that word is capitalized. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. Now, some of you are aware that there's some parallels there with Genesis 1:1 and John 1:1. And if we had the time, we would go deep into these parallels and what it's saying and all that, but we don't have time for that. But in Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and he said, let there be light. And he said, and he said, and he said. In John 1:1, it says, in the beginning was the Word. Was the Word. And we could go farther into that, where the Word brings light, is the light, but we won't. So you see there's these parallels, there's these common themes, but there's a difference, a significant difference in those opening verses. In Genesis 1:1, it's about divine doing. In John 1:1, it's about a divine being. In Genesis 1:1, it says that God created. What he's doing in John 1:1 says in the beginning was the Word. It's his being, who he was. Now, we have to really focus on this word with capital W. And again, we could go super deep on this. The Greek word is logos, and there's so much about Greek philosophy and their thoughts about the mind of the universe and all the power and all that. Let me explain it this way, to simplify it, because I'm a simple guy. Let's simplify it this way. And we use the literal word, words. Okay. So I'm speaking words right now. More than you. That's the way this is set up in here, okay? That's how it's designed. I'm speaking words. My words are an audible expression of inaudible thoughts, feelings, ideas, and truths that I have here. That I have these thoughts, I have these truths that I have here. But until I express them, you won't know them. So I have put together a sermon for us today. Last week I promised you today would be a sermon. I put together a sermon for us today. It's in my head. I could preach a sermon this way. But you would never know the sermon because it's going on in my head. It's inaudible until I say words that become audible. I hope that makes sense. Anybody? Okay, we've already gone to sleep. Okay, so it's the audible expression of the inaudible thoughts. So when it says here, the Word, capital W, that Jesus is the visible expression of the invisible God. That he is this expression of who God is. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, it says that he, talking about Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God. That God reveals himself, he expresses himself through Jesus. Or in Hebrews chapter 1, where it says, he's done this through the prophets, but now through his Son. And then it says in Hebrews 1, who is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being. That this is who Jesus is. He is the Word. He is the visible expression of God. So when he says in John chapter 10, I and the Father are one, which really upset the religious leaders, that he would put himself on par and equal with the Father. He says, I and the Father are one. Or what he would say in John chapter 14, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so John just comes right out of the gate and says, let's be really clear about who we're talking about here. That Jesus is not just a really good man. He was a really good man, but that's not just what he was. Jesus was not just the best teacher that ever lived. He was the best teacher that ever, but not just. He's not just a healer. He's not just a rabbi. He's not just a religious leader. He's not an angel. He's not the brother of Satan. Jesus is God. And from the very beginning, John says, I want to make sure you're really clear, not just what Jesus did, but who he is. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, interesting, the other gospel writers, they get to that point, but they kind of slowly develop it. Over time, as they're writing, they finally get to that point. John just says from the very beginning, it's kind of like this. Some of you are old enough to remember Polaroid cameras and pictures. You take a picture, and this little thing comes out, and then you wave it. Not that that did anything, but we all did. Just kind of wave it, like it wouldn't develop otherwise. And then slowly the image would come in, and then you would have the picture. That's how the other gospel writers do this with the divinity of Jesus. John's is more like a digital camera. You take the picture, boom, bam, there it is, megapixels. It is right there in high definition, right here, right now. This is who Jesus is. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was with God in the beginning. John wants to make sure we understand this about Jesus. Before we get into anything else, know who we're dealing with. Jesus is eternal. John wants to make sure that we don't think that Jesus started on December 25th, year 0 or something. Jesus doesn't start at the Christmas pageant. That Jesus isn't a Christmas beginning. Jesus begins long before that. And not just once upon a time. He says he begins once before time. That he is eternal, that he is timeless, that he is God. So in John chapter 8, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. That's not just bad grammar. That's a statement of his eternal nature. Before Abraham was, I am. Or in John chapter 17, when he prays his high priestly prayer. And he prays, Father, glorify me with the glory I had with you before the world began. This is Jesus, the eternal one. All right, we got to keep going. All right, let's move on. Verse 3. Oh, man, I just wish we could go deep on this stuff. Verse 3. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. Again, let's remind ourselves that Jesus is not a created being. He is the uncreated one. In fact, he is the agent of creation, that Jesus is the creator. Because there are some that will teach that Jesus was created by God. Jesus was created and maybe he was the brother of Lucifer. No. John's saying Jesus is the creator. You know what I love and hate about this time of year? It's something that I'm not sure if I love it more or hate it more, but is that it gets dark earlier. I kind of hate that. But here's what I love about that. On clear days, clear nights, I have a hammock on my back patio. And I love going out there at dusk or just beyond and laying on my hammock. Sometimes my wife lays with me on that hammock. Sometimes she's on a chair. Sometimes I'm by myself. Sometimes we have music. But to lay it there and just to look up at the stars and they start 1, 2, 3. See, this time of year I can do it. In June and July, I can't stay up that late. But this time of year I can. And to lay there and just to look at the stars. And the longer you lay there, the more stars you see. And if it's clearer than the satellites, an occasional shooting star. I mean, I could do that for hours every night. I just love that. And when I lay there and look at those stars, I think of that passage from Isaiah chapter 40, where Isaiah writes, lift up your eyes to the heavens. And then he throws out this question, who created all these? And then he answers the question, he who brings out the starry hosts one by one and calls them each by name. According to his great power and his mighty strength, not one of them is missing. Who's Isaiah talking about? Jesus. He's the creator. In Psalm 8, where it says that, oh Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And then a few verses later, it says, when I think about the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you've set in place, what is man that you're mindful of him, the son of man that you care? Who's he talking about? Jesus. In Psalm 19, when it says, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hand, day after day they pour forth speech, night after night. Who's he talking about? Jesus. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, when it says that, for by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible or invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. Who's he talking about? Jesus. And John says, you got to understand this. Jesus is the creator of the world. That's very important, because if you realize Jesus is the creator of the world, then in John chapter 2, which we'll look at in 3 weeks, when Jesus turns water into wine, it's not that difficult for a guy who created the whole cosmos to turn water into wine, is it? Or when we look in John chapter 6 of feeding the 5,000 right about Thanksgiving, it's not so weird that Jesus, the creator of the entire universe, could take some bread and some fish and turn it into multiplied abundance for 5,000 people. Or when we get to John 21, in May, when he's at a campfire and he's grilling fish that he didn't go fishing for. It's not a big deal, because he's the creator of the world. He can create his own fish if he wants. And Jesus is his creator. And Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6, there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. Jesus says, John says, before we ever get started, let me be very, very clear. Jesus is the pre-existent, eternal creator of all things. And then he kind of turns the corner a little bit and brings it a little closer to home. Verse 4. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. Now, in verse 4 here, we're seeing two themes that we will see over and over again this year. Because 35 times in the book of John, he talks about life. 21 times he talks about light, and very often they're brought together as in this verse. That he is the one who brings life, and in him is life, and in that life is the light of men. So if Jesus is the one who created life, and he is the source of life, then he will also have the deepest answers to life. Like the question, why? Jesus would tell us the reason, the meaning, the purpose. Like the question, how? How do I live my life? Jesus becomes the reference point for all of our life. The decisions we make, the priorities we make, how we live our life. In Acts chapter 3, Jesus is referenced as the author of life. And I find it interesting that author is the root word of the word authority. That Jesus, the author of life, is the authority for life. Jesus says, you want to understand life? You want to experience life? Go my way. Listen to my words. Follow my plan. Because I'm the author of life. I'm the creator of life. I'm the authority on life. There are some of us, probably all of us if we're honest, many of us in this room would look back on our lives, and some of the things that we have the greatest regrets of doing, saying, being in our lives are when we were the authority on our life and not Jesus. The greatest regrets we have is when we said, okay, Jesus, I know what you said, I know what your word says, I know what you want, but I think I know better on this. I think I'll be the authority. I think I will author this chapter, this season, this night, this decision, this relationship, this priority. I'll take the pen on this one. And those are the things we regret the most because we didn't listen to the author. He's the one that understands. Let me try to illustrate this way. In the mid-'80s, U2 came out with an album called Joshua Tree. Arguably, no, without argue, one of the greatest albums of all time, and since I'm speaking and you're not, the discussion's over. But that album came out, and there was a song called Where the Streets Have No Name. Great song. Well, I graduated from college, and my roommate and I, former roommate and I, had gotten back together, and we were talking about this album, and we were talking about, what does this song really mean? You know, Where the Streets Have No Names. So we're going through that, and he had a very put together thought, plan, idea of what this song meant. He had an opinion of what it meant and what these streets were and all this. I said, yeah, I don't think that's where he's coming from. And we kind of got into this disagreement, this argument of what this song actually means. Now, hypothetically, while we're having that discussion of what is the meaning of Where the Streets Have No Name, what if Bono walks into the room and he says, what are you guys talking about? Said, we're just discussing the meaning of the lyrics of Where the Streets Have No Name. And Bono says, oh, well, that's interesting. I wrote that song. And then he begins to tell us about the streets of Belfast and the tension between the Protestants and the Catholics and the rich and the poor, and how depending on which street you lived on, you could tell by the name of your street of which side you were on, and the division and the hatred and all the violence, and how great it would be if there was equality and peace and where the streets have no name. And we look at him and say, no, we don't think that's what that's about. Like, what do you mean, no? I wrote it. I know what I was talking about. That's exactly what it's about. As ridiculous as that sounds, how often have I heard what Jesus, the author of life, says, this is what it's all about? And I was like, nah, I don't think so. It's like, you don't think so. How about asking the author? That's why we want everyone to find and follow Jesus, because in him is life, and that life is the light of all mankind. Oh man, I'm out of time. We got to keep going. We got one more verse. Okay, verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it, overcome it, comprehended it. Different ways you could translate that. Now, there's a lot, and if we had time, we would go into, many believe that that's about the crucifixion and the resurrection, that the darkness couldn't snuff out the light because the light comes up in the midst of the darkness, but we won't go into all that. But this is what I want to look at, is this word shines. Because remember, follow me on this one. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were created. Without him, nothing was created that has been created. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. What tense are all of those? Did you guys not take English? What tense were all of those? Past tense. It's all past tense. This is what's happened, this is what's happened, this is what's happened, until he gets to the word shines. Present tense. Subtle little thing. But you can't miss this. He doesn't say shine, shone. He says shines, present tense. That when we have life in Jesus, there's light. This light represents the presence of God. And it's not just something he did. It's something he does. It's something he's doing. And it's not just someday when we die in eternity. It's here and now that we have this shining of Christ's presence with us here and now. And as I said, all the way through, we'll see this dynamic of life and light and Jesus being the light and bringing us life. And it just recurs over and over again in this life. It's in Christ. I mean, that very familiar verse, John 3:16, we'll look at in 4 weeks with Nicodemus. John 3:16, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. John chapter 6, verse 40, God says, I've ordained it so that anyone who looks to him and believes in him will have eternal life. John 10:10, Jesus said, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. John 11:25, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. You know, he who believes me will live even after he dies. In John 14:6, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That it's in him. And when he's talking about life and the light that is in our lives right here and now, he's talking about eternal life. It's not just that, okay, yeah, when you die, you can live for billions of years in the clouds, whatever. That's not even what he's talking. I mean, that's part of it. That's bonus. But he's talking about now, his life is not quantity, it's quality. It's not just, okay, you want to have billions of years? Great, come on with me. No, he says it's quality. You want to have a life with purpose and meaning and forgiveness and grace and power? It's the life that I offer to you. And so we see this picture of Jesus, the pre-existent one, the eternal one, the agent of creation, the creator, the author, the source of life. All of these grand, glorious pictures of Jesus. But let me put one more out there and bring it down, that he's infinite. And infinite is not the same as eternal. Infinite has to do with capacity. That there's no limit to his capacity. Which means that the infinite God has the capacity with 7-8 billion people on the planet to know every detail about your life. St. Augustine said, God in his infinite greatness loves each one of us as if there were only one of us to love. His full attention on you. That he created you. He sees you. He knows you. He loves you. And he invites you to life. So without getting narcissistic or too stuck on yourself, let's think about this way. That God in all of his infinite glory, capacity, knows that it's no accident that you would be here today. That maybe God ordained through his Spirit that these words were written not just for humanity, but for you. That these words, we'll revisit, John 20, verse 31, are for you. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And that by believing, you may have life in his name. You. 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 Every single one. And Jesus says, come on in. The door's open. See, some of you today, you might be saying, and for the first time, that kind of makes sense. You know what Jesus says? Come on in. The door's open. Some of you might be saying, still not buying it, not sure. Jesus says, it's all right. Come on in. The door's open. Some of you believe this and have been walking with him. He says, come on in. The door's open. Can I give you 3 just really, really simple prayers that maybe you'll pray one of these? If today you're like, man, I get it now. It makes sense. Here's your prayer. Jesus, give me your life. Jesus, give me your life. And some of you are saying, yeah, not with you yet. Would you have the courage to pray this prayer? Jesus, reveal yourself to me. And if all of this is a bunch of hogwash and he doesn't exist, nothing's lost. No, you don't have to tell anybody. But if it's true and he does, it change your whole life. And those of you walking with Jesus, just simply pray, Jesus, make me more like you. Make me more like you. So today, core of discovery, we embark on a journey to learn, to explore, to discover, and to live in Jesus. He says, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Oh, what a beautiful name it is. What a wonderful name it is. What a powerful name it is.